Hello, everybody. Venom Lion here, and I need a coffee. Be right back. I'm not religious in any form, but I want to take some seconds right here, right now, to thank Jesus or whoever for coffee. Thank you, Jesus. All right, boys. So yeah, Venom Lion here with part 2 of this wonderful GDC talk, Halo 4 post-mortem. First part, I had a lot to say. This is so interesting to me. Design is a passion of mine. I really like it. So hopefully this second part right here will have more interesting tidbits. And on that note, guys, let's just go.
So the next thing I want to talk about is tying into deep fiction.
Right, transmedia.
Halo is a universe that is incredibly rich, and we spend a lot of time building that universe that surrounds the games. And we made a decision pretty early on that we wanted to connect everything together as best that we could, because that was really important to us.
Yeah.
So I want to give a couple of examples of where I think we did a good job of this in one case in Halo 4, and one where I think, we missed the mark a bit, and I'll explain why.
Cool. I really like that he gives two examples like that.
Is a character named Thomas Lasky.
Yep.
This is a character that's first introduced in Karen Travis's The Thursday War, but he's really examined within the live-action digital series Forward Unto Dawn. And this is a series that...
And I'm assuming this is a good example, right? Because I even said so in my Halo 4 playthrough. I think that how they handle Lasky in the game and in the movie fit perfectly well, because in the game you have a sense of the character, and you can tell he's on Chief's side. You probably met him before, but you don't need to know more than that, basically. And in Forward Unto Dawn, you basically know more about the character. I think that's good.
Follows Lasky as a cadet when he's having kind of he's having a crisis in terms of his belief in the UNSC and the war effort.
Yeah.
And then he runs into the Master Chief, who kind of teaches him the nature of what it means to be a hero. And then later, Lasky is a major character in our campaign, and he goes on to become the commander of the Infinity in our multiplayer that takes place after the campaign story. So the reason why this was successful, I think, is because Lasky, each of the stories that we were telling here were self-contained.
I agree.
So you could go and you could watch Forward Unto Dawn, and you could be really satisfied and feel like you got a completed story. The same was true for our campaign.
Yes.
And the same was true for Spartan Ops.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of the argument there, right? I'm going to take Final Fantasy 15 again, because... God, that fucking game. It really pissed me off. I even talking about it now, I get fucking agitated, because Final Fantasy is whatever. I'm not gonna go on that tangent. I'm gonna stop it, right? I'm just gonna say what I need to say about the game, and then we'll move on. A good example of a bad way to implement that is Final Fantasy 15. You play the game, and at some point, one of your 3 party members leave. Wait, is there 3 or 4 party members? 3, right? Yeah, 3. No, 4. There's 4. Okay. Yeah, one of the 4 leaves your party for a chapter, and then you meet him back while he's in a mining town. He's wearing this costume, and then you're like, "Oh, are you ready to go back?" And he's like, "Yes, I'm back." And you're like, "What did you go ahead and do?" And he doesn't say. And as a player, you're like, what? That's not self-contained. Somebody left you for a whole chapter, and he comes back, he's like, I'm done. And you're like, done doing what? And he's like, buy the DLC, dumbass. So yeah, that's atrocious. Fucking Final Fantasy 15, man. And God...
I think the other thing was that this was a character very likable in terms of the characterization. But also, he had a very simple and powerful arc. He went from this reluctant, disbelieving cadet to a rebellious officer that helps the Master Chief, and then rises to become the commander of the Infinity. So it was something that was really clear and understandable.
True.
And contrast that against the Didact. So the Didact was our main villain for Halo 4. We wanted to introduce an antagonist that was worthy of the Chief, someone that could really threaten the Master Chief for
Oh yeah, so then in gameplay we can just, you know, like press A to win. Makes a lot of sense.
the very first time. When we knew that we wanted to use the Didact in this role, we put a bunch of effort into exploring his character in a series of books, the Forerunner trilogy by Greg Bear.
Oh.
And this is a character that also appeared previously to that in the terminals in Halo 3. So there was a lot of background and texture that was developed outside of the main game. In addition to that, in the game, he appears in our campaign story. He also appears in a series of motion comics that are unlocked through terminals that are populated throughout our campaign. I think, you know, this was a character that really resonated with players. They really enjoyed him as a villain. But there were players that felt like his motivations were not clear. And we were like,
wow, right. I don't know what his motivations are. He wants to use a composer to turn humans into Prometheans. Why though? I don't know. So yeah, I guess they did a bad job with that, as he says, because I have no idea. And I played the game.
Surprised by this because we thought, okay, you know, his motivations in the game are pretty simple. He's a badass alien who you reawaken and he wants to obliterate humanity. And, you know, it's pretty clear. It should read at a basic level. But what we allowed ourselves to do in telling the story was we brought a lot of those more subtle motivations that existed in the surrounding fiction and allowed those to bleed into the main story of Halo 4. And what that did was it created the impression with some players that they were missing the larger story if they didn't take part in the books or if they didn't watch the terminals. And in addition to this, something that kind of compounded this was the fact that, you know, we had to move the terminal videos, the motion comics, off of the disk for disk space reasons, and we placed those on waypoints so players could go and watch them online or through the Waypoint console client. The problem with this was that it was outside of the main game, and so it was a frustrating experience for some players because they had to go through an extra step to get that information. So the next thing I want to talk about is the introduction of the Prometheans. The Prometheans were, for us, the new enemy class that we added to Halo 4. They were essentially the minions of the Didact. And this was a big deal for us. This was a big bet, because this would be the first time that a new enemy class was added to Halo in over a decade.
True.
And we wanted these guys to be fun to fight, as compelling to fight as the Covenant, and yet very, very different in terms of their behaviors. We wanted them to feel unique. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail because Scott Warner gave a talk earlier this week about all the details of developing this enemy class and some of the challenges that we went through mechanically. I do want to focus a bit on kind of the main character in this enemy class, which is the Knight, and some of the challenges that we went through in developing
it. I want to hear this.
So there were a couple of sides to this. You know, one was on the mechanical side, and one was on the visual side. And I'm going to show you just a bunch of images.
Yeah, we saw that already.
The development of the character. On the mechanical side, we set out with a number of goals that we wanted to achieve with the Knight. But we weren't really clear up front in expressing what those goals were. You know, we were kind of vague. We said, oh, we want them to be fun, we want them to be dynamic, we want them to be collaborative. But, you know, early on, we weren't clear enough about what success meant for any of those adjectives.
Yeah.
It wasn't until we became really clear in defining what the success criteria was that we were able to see sustained momentum and improvement. On the visual side, you can see all of these different iterations that we went through with the Knight. We rebuilt this character at least 3 times from the ground up during the production of Halo 4 because we weren't happy with it, with various different versions of it. We explored more robotic looks, more organic looks. We had a version where there was an AI rider that was inside of it. I think, you know, one of the big challenges here for us was that we had a conflict between the narrative aspects of this character, the mechanical aspects of this character, and the visual aspects of this character. And early on, we weren't clear enough about what would lead. And each of these different aspects were being, at various times, developed almost in isolation of one another. And so what we found was, we would go down a path with mechanics and then discover, oh, well, now we've introduced a behavior that doesn't make sense with some of the established fiction. Or we would go down a path with visuals and we would say, oh, this is a cool-looking character, but it doesn't support the gameplay needs that we have for this character mechanically. And
as you said there, right, it seems like they were developing in silos, which basically is so bad in games. Basically, I think you have like developing in silos, which means basically like every department does their thing, right? It's a silo. And then there's an output at the end, and then you just put everything together. Obviously, it doesn't work. Like working in silos in games, no. And sometimes some people are trying to, veer production towards that a bit, because like it feels natural, right? You want to work on the thing you've been tasked with, like, and not worry about like all the things, because there is a lot of noise in game production. It's hard to just like sit down with your part of the game and then just do it, right? Because like there's gonna be changes coming at you from every fucking angle all the time, right? Because like making a game is so iterative and so collaborative that all the pieces that you need to build what you're trying to build always change. So it can become a bit frustrating sometimes to feel like you've spent the whole week on something that changed so much that your design is not relevant anymore. But that's just the nature of the beast, right? You cannot just be like, okay, I'm going to go ahead, shut myself in a room and come out with the finished product, because then all the other departments are going to be like, oh, well, actually it doesn't fit my design, doesn't fit like the narrative. Like it doesn't work, right? So that is bad.
So it wasn't until we became really clear about what the prioritization was of these different elements and who would lead that we were able to find success.
Yeah.
In the end, we were really happy with the way that this character turned out, but honestly, it was so painful, and we could have done a much, much better job of getting to the end point and done that a lot more effectively and efficiently. Along with Prometheans, we introduced a whole cast of new weapons with Forerunner weapons. And this was a really exciting thing for us, because anytime you get the opportunity to add new toys to the weapons sandbox, that's awesome. And
sure.
When we started out, I was really pushing the team to go in a very sci-fi direction. I wanted to embrace the sci-fi nature of the enemies and explore a lot of really kind of concepts that were outside the box for Halo, things that you'd never seen before in the Halo sandbox.
Oh, see, that is way more interesting. Like, I don't really know what these does, right? You have some shapes that hint towards, like, one being more of a flamethrower, a bit like that one over there, maybe, like with the tip there and stuff. That one, though, I have no idea. If I saw that on the ground in Halo 4, I would pick it the fuck up and try it out immediately, right? Yeah, I'm curious about what he's going to say about the weapons, because, like, the new weapons that they added in Halo 4 serve no purpose, in my humble opinion, right? Yeah, I'm really curious about what he's going to say. Yeah, because, like, they started, like, with a really sci-fi thing, and then they moved from, wanting to make their weapons be recognizable, but that means that they're just, like, copies of existing weapons, basically. So, yeah, interesting.
We explored things like a stasis gun and a grapple harpoon.
Sounds amazing.
A lot of really abstract sci-fi shapes in the design of the weapons. And what we found as we were testing these weapons with players is that the really deep sci-fi approach when we were taking it was something that wasn't relatable. And as a result, they weren't really gravitating towards these weapons. They would just toss them aside and use the Covenant weapons or the UNSC weapons and just sort of forget about these new ones, which really sucks when you're making new weapons and nobody wants to use them.
Yeah, and okay, yeah, in their defense, right? Because you guys know my opinion on the guns, right? They serve no purpose. Why even add them? Like, you just spent like some budget time reskinning new guns. Like, you spent some concept artist time, some animators, some designers time, and some artist time, all trying to make these new things that basically doesn't add much to the game, right? And what he said there is kind of sad, because they tried at first, right? And they found that players were not using them. which is definitely something that I've seen happen in development. Like you try something new that you think is going to be interesting, and then it doesn't stick. However, I think they did a complete 180 there. Instead of like tweaking the weapons so that the players could see the benefit of these weapons from the get-go, right? How do you do that? Mission design and level design could be one way. You start a level, let's say, the player has only one weapon that he finds, and that gun is really effective against an enemy type, right? Depending on how you set the level up and the mission objectives and everything, you can force or heavily encourage, is what I meant to say, players to see the benefit of these new weapons. And then, once you see the added benefit of a game mechanic or a weapon or a player ability, they are much more likely to afterwards want to use that power, that weapon by themselves, because you've taught them how useful it is. A good example of that is, well, it's a good and a bad example, but in the episode in which like I found the Promethean vision, right, in the fog, without it, I couldn't see enemies, and with it, I could see enemies. So I was like, oh, nice. Now, unfortunately, I think I've never encountered another foggy area in the game. So I never thought, oh, I need the Promethean vision now. But if I would have reached another area with a dense fog, and there was like a Promethean vision, visor nearby, of course I would have used it, because in an earlier level, I learned that when there's fog, that baby is going to do me a lot of good. So I think there's contextual ways to encourage people to understand a weapon. And also, like, if some players don't like a weapon, that is fine, right? I'm a huge rifle guy. I've only, at the end of Halo 4, found love for shotguns, right? And I know you guys, like, in every one of my playthrough, in almost every episode, there's one guy out there who's like, bro, the shotguns, bro. I'm not really a shotgun guy. That is okay. I like my rifles. I like my sniper. That's just the way I is, bro. That's interesting. Yeah, let's keep on going. I'm really curious to see, like, the reasons that brought them to having such, like, boring weapons, you know?
That's not really achieving your goal. So ultimately, we turned a corner with these when we found a unique visual signature for them, where we would have the weapons form into place and kind of transform to suit their user. And we had the D-res effects that would happen when you would kill an enemy with some of these weapons. And then we chose to really turn these into counterparts of existing paradigms within the Halo weapon sandbox. And so you can see here, you know, this example of the scatter shot. Very clearly an advanced shotgun. You know, you can bounce projectiles off of surfaces, you can res enemies, but at its core, this is a shotgun. And as soon as we went down that path, we saw players understanding how to use these weapons. They became much more popular, and you know, mission accomplished with that.
Yeah, playtesting, you need to be careful about the data, how you interpret the data of playtests, right? Because playtests, for you who don't know, is basically you're in production, you're in full swing, you're trying stuff out, shooting a lot of stuff at the wall, trying to see what sticks. Then you get a bunch of players inside your studio, you put the prototypes in their hands, and you're like, what do you think? Obviously, right, like with those weapons, they found in playtests that the weapons that ended up being in Halo 4 worked best, right? Players were able to wrap their heads around the new guns. However, I think looking back, pretty much every player would have preferred to have like one or two really out there weapons in place of all these new weapons, right? That would be way more fun than these weapons that we had. Because, like, yeah, one of my favorite weapons in Halo 4 was the sticky gun, right? It was there in one mission. I really enjoyed using it. And why did I enjoy it? Because it wasn't like a third version of a fucking shotgun, you know? So yeah, that is very unfortunate.
So another aspect of the game where we employed story was with Infinity multiplayer.
Spartan Ops?
This was another big change for Halo. Because if you look at Halo games in the past, multiplayer has always been kind of off on the side. It's been disconnected from the fiction of the universe. And we wanted to change that with Halo 4. So we created this ship called the UNSC Infinity And this, we decided, would be home to our entire multiplayer experience. It was a ship that was introduced in our campaign where the Chief and the Infinity cross paths, and they help one another on their adventures. And then the Infinity goes on to become the star of Spartan Ops and the Infinity CG series, and home to all of the multiplayer modes within Halo 4.
See, I think that's something that they did very well with Halo 4, right? I think the different game modes feel cohesive. I think I talked about that in my 2 reaction videos to the Spartan Ops cutscenes, but that is something they did very well. Like all the modes, probably not the actual like PvP multiplayer part of it because it has no story, but it feels cohesive, and that's pretty good, to be honest.
So part of the reason why we wanted to employ story here was that historically we've had these 2 audiences in Halo. 2 audiences that have some crossover, but not as much as we would like. An audience that loves campaign, and an audience that gravitates more towards multiplayer.
Yep.
And by binding the experiences together through story, we wanted to bring these 2 audiences closer together. We wanted to create an experience that would allow campaign players to engage online in Spartan Ops and learn some of the skills they would need to be successful in multiplayer.
Yeah.
And also introduce multiplayer players to the story of our universe and hopefully entice them to come and play our campaign.
That makes perfect sense.
There's another push that we had with Halo 4, which was to make Halo a more accessible multiplayer experience. Historically, Halo's been very hardcore, and it's had a very steep learning curve that has turned off a lot of players.
Yeah, and like, because I think we're all like power gamers here, right? We're all like gamers, TM, you know. So we don't think about that, but like that is another topic that is really interesting to me, right? It's called video game literacy. I could talk about it for a long time, but like my ex, I've made her play games, right? She used to not game at all. And then she saw me play the Fallout games and she really wanted to play it, right? So the first game that she ever beat was Fallout 3. Us gamers will be like, oh, Fallout 3, that's not like that hard of a game, right? Like you could play it easily, but like for somebody who doesn't know how to even like move around in first person, like the first few hours were really challenging for her, you know, like all the different like things our fingers are used to do, she wasn't able to do them properly, right? So like even like turning around, like she got an enemy in her face and she was like, okay, I'm moving away, but she was just like, you know, backtracking. She wasn't like turning around and sprinting. She was just like, okay, I'm backing away. Okay, now I need my gun. So like she clicked and then the gun came up and then she was like, oh my God. And she couldn't move and aim at the same time for the first like maybe 6 hours, right? That is stuff that we laugh at now, but we all been there. We just don't remember it. When I was a young kid, I was playing Zelda Ocarina of Time on the N64, and that was like in the first few moments of 3D. Gamers weren't used to 3D in that time, and I remember in the starting village, there is that fucking bridge that leads to some rupees. It's kind of like a thin bridge, and you can fall off. That was so hard to do. Nowadays, like any gamer could just like blast through that bridge easily, right? But since I didn't have the literacy of navigating in 3D environments, that was really hard for me to do back then. And same thing for multiplayer, right? Multiplayer is hard because you're pitting players which have a lot of video game literacy against people who potentially have none. And since like as a designer, you cannot control how like a player with low video game literacy would actually interact with other players. Well, multiplayer, you need to get good and you need to go at a certain level in order to just even stand a chance to have even a tiny bit of fun. So yeah, anything that pushes player slowly towards more challenging gameplay, gives them abilities that they will need to transition to like harder content is always good because you feed them. You literally like give them knowledge that will be applicable in order to make them better video game players, which will then give them more opportunities to play more games, play more complex games, understand the language, go into multiplayer, all that good stuff. That was a very long tangent. I'm sorry.
So we wanted to help new players find success We wanted to give them opportunities in modes like Infinity Slayer to earn power weapons that they might never have got a chance to use in multiplayer before. And we wanted to use story as a way of contextualizing our sci-fi universe.
Yeah, that's cool.
You know, one of the barriers to entry with an experience like Halo is the fact that it is sci-fi. And so if I show you, you know, these two weapons, the weapon on the left is instantly something that you can understand. But if you've never played Halo before, the needler on the right may be completely opaque to you. And so story, by engaging people in an ongoing story and showing them some of these tools within that context, it allows us to teach players some of the rules of our universe and get them familiar with our world. Very true. That is important. One of the big pushes that we made with Halo 4 was to tell episodic story in Spartan Ops. We created a new mode where we would release a new episode of a CG series each week along with 5 missions that went live and tied into that story. And over the course of a 10-week season, we would be providing 50 missions and over 30 minutes of CG storytelling. That's a lot. For us, this was an incredibly ambitious endeavor, particularly from a production standpoint, but also creatively, because we'd never told story in this way before in Halo. This was a mode that was designed primarily as a co-op experience. And one of the things that was surprising for us to learn as we went live was the number of players that played this solo. We didn't expect that. We optimized this to be played with 2 to 4 players, and we balanced the experience accordingly. And so in hindsight, when I look at the number of players who have chosen to play Spartan Ops as a single-player mode, I think, if we could go back in time, we would probably balance things a little bit differently to accommodate that. Okay, so it's balanced for 2 to 4 players. There's basically always the same kind of enemies, the same amount and everything. So that is very interesting. And yeah, if you offer players like content that can be done in group or alone, the balancing is not going to be the same, right? So if you have the option for it, it should be balanced in consequence to that, obviously. But yeah, they did not foresee that thing happening. So that probably explains why a lot of players think Spartan Ops are fucking boring, because it's not made to be played alone, obviously. So I don't have a ton of magical takeaways that are going to help you conquer the universe in creating your own games. But I can tell you some of the things that we learned. Some of these may be obvious. Some of them are simply things that we allowed ourselves to stray from over the course of development and that ended up biting us in the ass. So the first of those is making sure that narrative is self-contained. And I think when you have a universe that is as large and as rich as ours, and you're immersed in it every single day, it can be really easy to get kind of inside baseball in your understanding of all of those different narrative pieces. Yep. And it's really important for us to be diligent about looking at every story that we're creating and making sure that it can stand on its own feet and that it's self-contained and satisfying enough in and of itself. And so that's something we have to keep reminding ourselves of each and every day. True. The second, and this should be straightforward, but clearly it's something that we allowed ourselves to get away from, is setting really clear goals for prototype. Oh, yeah. One of the things that we embrace... Like when you're making a prototype, you should basically be answering a question. That's as simple as it is. Also, guys, just a reminder, if you want to subscribe to this channel, when I will hit 2K subscribers, I'm going to make an episode or a series playing my own prototype that got me into the games industry in the first place. So go ahead and sub if you aren't already. That was my YouTuber moment right there. With Halo 4, in our pursuit of quality that really paid off, was a very iterative approach to development. But when you're entering into an iteration loop, there are all these different stages that you have to make sure that you're respecting. And so I've kind of defined what I think those stages are. These are my words. But you start by envisioning the experience that you're trying to create. And then you need to communicate or assert what that experience is in a way that is clearly understandable. What are the goals? And then you need to test and verify against those goals. And then take the results of that test, reinterpret them, and use that to envision the next loop of iteration. Yeah. And I think every time we allowed ourselves to skip over one or more of these steps and get away from these different components of the iteration loop, we found ourselves spinning our wheels and not making the progress that we would like.
Yeah, I can see that.
So early on in the creative process for Halo 4, we were assembling this team of super ninjas from around the industry, and I think there was a real reticence to put boundaries in place because we were like, we want to keep things as open as possible because the possibilities are endless. And what we really discovered is you need boundaries, you need constraints.
Oh yeah.
Great creative comes from dealing and rubbing up against those constraints and understanding clearly what they are.
Oh, big true there. Creativity is not found in the absence of constraints. Creativity comes from trying to solve problems. If you're trying to do a creative endeavor, whatever it is, and you don't know where to start, give yourself some constraints. I'm not lying to you. Humans are really creative when it comes to problem solving. If you give yourself constraints, you will find yourself you have a problem, so you will be really creative in order to find ways around it. That is how creativity works. That was a big truth for me, dog.
And so it's really important to put those boundaries in place and make them as clear as possible, as early as possible, so that people can really dig in and do their best creative work. This is one that is really not applicable to many people outside of 343 and the situation that we had. But I guess if you're taking on an existing IP with a large player base and a lot of passion and support around the current game, this is something you're going to have to tread the same balance that we did. And this was trying to find that delicate balance between familiarity and reinvention.
Oh, yeah.
Wanting to evolve and drive Halo forward into the future, but not make it so different that we weren't bringing along the existing passionate players that we had, bringing them along for the ride. And so this was a balance that we really struggled with and kind of honed in on over the course of building Halo 4.
Interesting.
Our team feels really strongly about quality.
Perfection is worthless in isolation.
About pursuing quality, pursuing perfection in everything that we do. And sometimes one of the things we allowed ourselves to do was really get minutely focused on an element of the game in isolation and try to perfect that without looking at it in context of the larger whole.
Oh yeah, that's bad.
So we have to keep reminding ourselves to make...
I think actually the weapons are a perfect example of that, right? Because if you look at it, like having the weapons being easily recognizable by player is not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing at all. If the players are familiar with the weapons, they will want to use them more, right? But if you then take that concept and you put it in the scope of the whole game, you're just adding a new suite of existing weapons, right? So yeah, that does make a lot of sense because I see that they did that error with the weapons.
Incremental progress across everything that we're doing and make sure that when we are honing and refining things, it's always being done in context of that larger experience. An example of this was with the Knight, where we would go off and we would be, really trying to hone the visual look of the Knight.
Working in silos.
Bringing all of that into the gameplay or vice versa. And anytime we allowed ourselves to go away from seeing things in context of the larger experience, there was pain. And finally, this is going to come across as a little bit trite, but I'm going to put it out there because it was so important to us. We learned as a team the importance of believing in ourselves and believing in our vision for Halo. There were times on this project where it seemed like we had an insurmountable challenge. It seemed like everything was stacked against us, and we didn't know how we were going to make it out. And the only thing that got us through in those moments was trusting in one another, believing in one another as a team, and making sure that we always had each other's backs.
It does sound really trite, right? I'm pretty sure that some of you guys are listening to that and you're like, oh, come on. But I mean, you cannot make it without your team, right? And there are moments during some productions where you're just like some weeks are incredibly hard when, you know, something doesn't stick and you can't find the angle to make it work. And then there are some art changes or narrative changes outside of your control that will affect what you're really trying hard to nail. Like, sometimes you can be a little bit desperate, right? It happens to me. Like, sometimes, you know, I'm not immune to that. Like, sometimes you just cannot seem to find a way to make what you're doing work. And ultimately, you need to have faith in your team, right? Like, I need to place my faith in the artists because they know what they're doing. They're going to help me. I'm going to help them. And together, we will create a better whole than if we just worked in silos on our own separate cubicles, you know? So, yeah, it is trite, I guess, but God, man, it's really true. It is simply true.
And that got us through some of the darkest times and ultimately led us to the success that we experienced with Halo 4. And so for us, that success was validated with the launch of Halo 4. You know, the response that we've had from the fans has been amazing, incredible, and just really rewarding for the team that worked on the game. And while we look at what we accomplished and we're really proud of it, when we think about where we want to go as a studio and where we want to take Halo in the future, we recognize that this is just the first step on a long journey and that we have better and brighter days ahead, but a lot of work that we have yet to do. And so that's my talk.
Okay, so I won't go over the questions because, you know, questions in the GDC talks are usually really low volume, hard to hear, and the video is long enough, so, you know, I'm going to end it soon. But very interesting. I can't wait to see what they are going to do with Halo 5. I know Halo 5 is where the majority of the criticism about like 343 comes from, so I'm really curious about that campaign because I don't know if I will like it, right? Halo 4 was enjoyable. I would go ahead and say like that was a solid first game from 343, right? Like their task was really not easy, guys. Like I cannot say that enough. That was a very hard mandate that they were given, right? Like that is hard. Like it is hard, right? And you know what? Halo 4, even though the last mission, I don't even want to talk about it anymore, they did a lot of good stuff. So yeah, that was interesting. All right, guys, I talked a lot about design and everything in this video. Still another long video, but hey, I have a lot of fun reacting to these and talking about design, development, and everything. Obviously, it's my career. I like doing it. So yeah, I hope you guys had a good time. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I'm going to see you in the next episode. Have a good one.